change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So if you could make it to the altar before being apprehended by the avenger of blood, and that's the nearest kinsman of the guy you killed, because the avenger of blood, that nearest kinsman, he had the responsibility of avenging the death of the relative that you just killed. So his job, not only his job, his obligation was to kill you. And that was for the honor of the family. So his job wasn't to seek justice. His job was to take vengeance. His job was to get vindication. And that's because there's absolutely no police force in Israel. So all the responsibility of trying to make things right, it all fell upon the family. So at this time, the only safe place for a person to go after being a manslayer, for being a manslayer, was the altar. And if he could get there, then the matter would be taken to the judges and the elders. And that's when they would find that this death was actually accidental. But eventually, the sanctuary or the safe place, it wouldn't be the altar in the middle of the camp. When they finally get settled into the land of Canaan, there will be designated 6 cities of refuge, and they'll all be scattered throughout Israel, and they're all strategically located so that if you were a manslayer, you could reach one of these cities in about a half a day's journey. And you can read about those cities. They're all written about in the book of Numbers in chapter 35 and in the book of Joshua, chapter 20. But here, now, in the wilderness, the only safe place was at God's altar. But none of these laws could ever be used to mitigate anyone who intentionally committed a premeditated murder. So if you committed a premeditated murder and you go up there and you start hanging on the altar, that wouldn't be protection for you. So if you fled to the altar after committing a murder, all they would do is they would just rip you away and they would execute you. They'd just take you out and stone you to death. And then we get to verse 15 and it says, "He who strikes his father or mother shall surely be put to death." And you might think, well, gosh, that's pretty extreme. That's pretty harsh for just a kid hitting his parent. But striking a parent here is to be taken in the context of he who strikes a man so that he dies. So this is a person who has just tried to murder or attempted to murder one of his parents. And so his punishment would be death. So his punishment would be capital punishment. And then it goes on and it talks about kidnapping. And kidnapping in our country, it used to be a capital crime. It used to be a death penalty offense. And you may think it should be still because of all the sex trafficking and that type of kidnapping. But most of the kidnapping that occurs in our country now is parental kidnapping, where someone takes and holds a child without the consent of the other parent and guardian. But in the ancient world, most of the slavery commonly occurred from kidnapping. So it's like that story of Joseph and his brothers in the book of Genesis when they sold them to go down to Egypt. And so this wasn't to be permitted in Israel because what this is a theft of a human being. This is a theft of a soul, and all souls belong to God. And then we go on and we read that not only striking a parent is a death sentence, but also a child who curses a parent is a death sentence. And so again, we would say, wow, this still seems very extreme. These laws are very strict. And you can see there is absolutely no mercy ever written in any of these laws. And so these strict laws, they were to be used as to be a deterrent, to be able to demand respect in the family, because the breakdown of the family is the beginning of the undoing of any society. And that was not going to be tolerated in Israel. But again, the idea of cursing a parent here is the idea of a child threatening his parent, like making a death threat. And then when we get to Deuteronomy 21:18, we'll find that it wasn't the parents who had the right to be able to carry out the sentence and the death of their child. They couldn't just go kill their kid because their kid just talked back to them. But they were required to take their child in front of the elders, the judges of the cities, to be judged in sentences. And one thing that you never read is you never read about the sentence ever being carried out in Israel. But God is serious about children respecting their parents' authority. And then you get down to verse 18, and now it starts to talk about striking someone when it doesn't kill them, but it creates this great bodily injury. So now if the person is struck and he lives for 2 days, they won't be charged with murder. But that person will still be civilly liable for that person that they struck. They'll be charged for their doctor's bills and their lost wages, everything until he heals from that injury. But here we see that even if this was a man's slave, and this is actually talking about a slave, this is not talking about a Hebrew servant, because a Hebrew servant wasn't to be treated like a slave. But it tells us here really plainly that this servant is his property. So if an owner and he beats his servant, be it a male or a female, and that slave dies, that owner will be punished. And what that's saying here is that he will be punished as a murderer, that owner will be put to death. And this is not like any of the other cultures of that day, where an owner could kill his slave for anything, because a slave was only property. But God, he doesn't see slaves as just pieces of property. He sees all people the same, all human beings, all of us. All of us are created in the image of God, and all of us have basic human rights. But if that slave, if he lives for 2 days, the owner won't be punished, because that means that it wasn't a premeditated murder. Because if he really wanted to kill his slave, he would have no trouble doing it. So this would prove that his motive wasn't murder, and he just loses his property. And where it says here, it says, he is his property, it literally means he is his money. So that just talks about the slave, that the slave was just his investment. It was just like having money. And then we get down to verse 22 about a pregnant woman. If she gets injured in the middle of a man fighting with her husband, and that baby is born premature and has no injuries, well, that's fine. And this man, he'll only get fined. He'll only have to pay the husband an amount of money that's agreed upon with the judges. And this word for judges here is not like the same word we read for judges earlier. This is not the word Elohim. This is the word pilim, which means an arbitrator or a meditator. And it actually looks like the word we have for like prelim. But if this baby dies, now the penalty is death. And that shows us that God sees these babies as human lives. And this is where it says, life for life. And so it really doesn't matter what the culture says. God sees human life from the very beginning, from its very conception. And when you look at this, and you look at this case, this here is not a premeditated murder. This injury was not intentional, but God still holds this man accountable, and he holds him accountable with his life. And then this verse goes on and it says, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And there's a lot of people they'll look at this law and they'll say, wow, that's so barbaric. But it's actually the very opposite of being barbaric. What this is saying is that the punishment, it has to fit the crime. It would have to be equal. No more, no less. And this all had to be done through the judges. And sometimes this is taken out of context, where they would say, well, that guy's hand was injured, so you have to injure that other guy's hand. But that's not the intent of this law. The intent of this law was to set limitations on how much you could require. It's on how far can you go? So it can't be like, well, you broke my hand, so I'm going to poke out your eyes and make you blind, because that would be escalating in your retribution. That punishment would not fit the crime. And you think about that, you think, like if your son or something accidentally knocked out your tooth, you wouldn't want to go knock out your tooth. He's your son, you love him. And so this is not saying if you lose a tooth and it, you have to go knock out the other person's tooth. This is saying if it's someone's fault, you can't go further than requiring a tooth from that person. So it wasn't a requirement that you had to take an eye or a tooth. It's just as far as you can go. And then you have to remember that Jesus, he prohibited this type of justice for his disciples. They weren't to retaliate against the people who wronged them, but they were to turn the other cheek, where the disciples were commanded not to exact personal revenge when injured, but they were commanded to forgive. Where a believer here, he can waive his legal rights to be able to bring glory to God. Okay, now you get down to verse 26, where that principle for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, well, that law did not apply to the slaves. So if it happened between a master and a slave, and that slave, he lost a tooth or he lost an eye, they were freed from their slavery. So this is a lot greater than vindication or a restitution, because a master, he may have the right to a slave's labor, but all people are equal in the eyes of God. And all people ultimately belong to God, because we're all made in God's image. So this owner, he doesn't get his eye pulled out or his tooth knocked out, but he loses the right of the use of that slave forever. And this probably kept a lot of slave owners, very careful about how they treated their slaves. And then we get to verse 28, and it starts to move into these laws regarding animals. And it talks about an ox goring a man or a woman to death. And an ox in this culture was more than just having a cow or a bull to have some beef. If you had an ox, it was like having a tractor. An ox was a tool for you to make money with, to plow the land. And not everybody had an ox. So if your ox killed someone, it's saying it had to be stoned. So what it's saying is like, this ox has to be executed. And so this is a public execution of the ox. You just couldn't slay the ox and go have a steak dinner. There could be no profit for the owner here from this ox. But there was also no punishment for the owner. But that's only if the ox owner didn't know that he had a mean bull. Because if he knew he had a mean bull that chased people and he didn't keep it confined for the safety of others, and if there was any kind of negligence on the part of the owner, he had known about this ox, and there was proof that he knew about this ox, well, then the ox was stoned to death, but the owner was stoned to death with him. But this owner, he could actually buy his way out of this execution if the other party who lost a loved one would take money for the compensation of their loss. And you can see here that this compensation is applied equally to any family member here. So it didn't matter if it was a son, it didn't matter if it was a daughter, an adult, or a child. It was always the same rights. They all have the same value to God. It wasn't just for the adults. But if it was a slave, there was a fixed price. And that fixed price was 30 shekels of silver. And that's where we get the price of where Jesus will be betrayed for. Jesus was betrayed for 30 shekels of silver. He was betrayed by Judas for the price of a dead slave. And though the owner can be redeemed with money here, the ox always had to be stoned to death. And then in verse 33, it starts to talk about personal accountability for damaging your neighbor's property. So it talks about a man opening a pit. And the reason a person would dig a pit would be to create a cistern to hold water or for grain storage. But they also dug pits for animal traps and for imprisoning people. But if you didn't cover that hole you dug, you were liable if your neighbor's animals fell into your pit and dies. And all of these laws here, they're all just monetary settlements. So, and it basically comes down to that you just have to buy his animal. So if it's an ox, well, now you're going to be eating steak all week. And if it's a donkey, you're probably not going to be eating anything all week because Jews can't eat donkeys because they're unclean animals. And so you probably didn't have any money to buy something else. But if it's your neighbor's ox and he fights with your ox and one of them dies, well, then what you do is you just kind of split the loss. And so now you both get to eat steak all week, and then you split the proceeds from the sale of the animal. But if it was your fault and you had a bad ox, you did have to take responsibility, and you got the dead ox. You got to keep the live one. But the thing is here is that you are accountable for your neighbor, and you're not allowed to have negligence. You will be accountable for your actions. So we're still in the middle of these laws that God had given to Moses to reveal to the people of Israel of how God wants them to govern in Israel. Where last week we dealt with the treatment of servants and slaves and murder and manslaughter, the remedies and restitutions for these injuries that can cause great bodily injury. And we dealt with restitutions for unfortunate deaths and the loss of personal property from negligence. And today we're going to still cover a wide variety of laws covering multiple subjects. And last week we left off talking about farm animals, and that's where we're going to begin again today. But today we're going to talk about the theft of these farm animals and the misappropriation of personal property from your neighbors. All right. So God, he's already given them the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. And so now this is going to be a refinement of that law. And this is to tell us what's to be done when someone gets caught breaking that commandment and they steal. And so these are the rules and these are the principles for the judges to apply to the things that are going to be happening in the daily life of all of those people who will be living in Israel. And you have to remember here, Israel is an agricultural society, and it's made up of mostly farmers and shepherds. And so these laws are going to begin with the theft of farm animals, of oxen and sheep. And this is nothing like the Old West, where you go out and you get your posse and you went out and you hung all those cattle rustlers, as if that was the worst crime that could ever be committed. In Israel, this was only a property crime where it was to be dealt with restitution. And here, the law, it makes a distinction between animals that are just stolen, that are still in possession of the thief, and the animals that were stolen that were already butchered and sold off. And so to kill and to sell someone's animals that weren't yours, that was much more serious, because that's more serious than just stealing the animals. And so there's going to be a heavier fine for those slaughtering and selling. And that's believed because it shows a greater intent that there was a premeditated plan for this theft. But when you find an animal that's still with a thief, and he's still in the presence of that thief may have just got caught up in the moment, where it may not have been his original intent to steal, but maybe where his covetousness had just got the best of him. And so the fine is not as bad. And it would always be a little harder to prove if somebody had already disposed of the animal by selling it or butchering it. All right. So the penalty for a thief that slaughter or sold an animal was 500% if it was an ox, but it's only 200% if it's found in the thief's hand. So for an ox, you had to pay back 5 to 1. 5 oxen for the 1 ox you stole if you killed it and sold it. But it's only 4 to 1 if it was a sheep, if you sold and butchered that. And so you wonder, you go, well, why is the penalty for stealing an ox greater than stealing a sheep? Well, the one thing is that an ox is more valuable than a sheep. But if you stole a man's ox, what you did is you stole his business, you stole his livelihood. That was like stealing his tractor. But if that animal, and it's found with the thief, you only had to pay double. But if you notice here, it doesn't mention any jail sentence at all. All of this is about restitution. It's all about restoring what was stolen. So this is a different legal system where restitution in our system is only secondary, where incarceration or jail time is always primary. And I'm not saying that theirs is better or right, but their system gave the thief a chance to change. It gave him the opportunity to make things right. And if that thief, if he couldn't pay back what he stole, and he wasn't able to make restitution for what he stole, he would be sold. And the proceeds from his sale would be going to the victim. And even in being sold, that thief could still have a productive life, because this Hebrew thief here, he still wasn't sold into a permanent slavery, but he was sold as an indentured servant. So that means he would serve for 6 years and he'd be freed on the 7th. And the law here, it also makes a difference between a daytime thief and a night thief, because at night, you wouldn't know if the thief is armed with a weapon. It'd be harder to identify your intruder. And so in this case, your life may be in danger. And also at night, it would also take you a lot longer to get help. So the owner here, he had the right to protect himself from the nighttime thief. So if he struck that thief at night and the burglar died, there was no crime on the owner's part. The owner is justified in using lethal force. But if that occurred in the daytime and the sun was out, you could only use less than lethal force. Because if you struck that thief and he died, you would now become a murderer and you would be executed. And that's because this is a property crime. You're only due to restitution. The thief, he had rights. Okay, and then the next law that we deal with, it deals with your neighbor allowing his animals to be able to graze on your property. And it says in your fields and in your vineyards. And in these days, your fields, they weren't fenced off. The only thing that identified your field from the neighbor's field were these stone markers, where you would mark off the corners of your field. So really, the animals, they wouldn't really know whose field they were in. Okay, so now let's say like your animal, he wanders into your neighbor's field and they go have their lunch over there. Well, if that happened, you wouldn't get out of it cheaply, because now you had to give to your neighbor not just any field or vineyard. It had to be your best.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel Waterford and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,